Hello and welcome to Carousel. I'm your new host, Barry Kesselman, and I'm going to be hopping on a carousel horse or two and go around finding interesting people and interesting projects and interesting subjects so that we can all have a good time together. I'm very fortunate today to have a most interesting person on a most interesting project and most interesting subject, a super tech spy. Now, we're really lucky because I'm finally able to talk to him since this project has been declassified. But he was involved in a technology project that enabled us to possibly avoid World War III. And it was done with amazing technology for its time that is barely comprehensible in the technology world, except if you look at technology today. My guest is Dr. Marty Yellin, and his project, along with the CIA, was something called Hexagon. And welcome, Marty.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barry.
Marty, I hope I didn't underplay your background there, but you really did do some amazing things, and I'd love to talk about it with you. So why don't you start us off with the project itself and perhaps how you got involved in it and why it was so important.
Okay, it started in 1965. I was working at a think tank in Terrytown doing medical research, of all things. I had a degree in engineering, and I was on my way towards a doctorate in medical engineering. And I received a phone call to come down to a place in New York for an interview because they wanted to hire me to come work in Connecticut on some project that they couldn't tell me about.
And you had any idea who the they was at that point?
No, in fact, I worked on it for 2 years before I knew who the customer was, the CIA. I was not allowed to know it, didn't have a need to know. Anyhow, I told him I wasn't interested, and he said, you better come down. I was 26, I was a kid, so I went to New York, and there was one guy there, and he gave me a whole bunch of tests, which were not even technical. They were kind of like spatial boxes. He said, draw pictures, do whatever you want with these boxes. I didn't know what I was doing, but apparently I passed the test. He said, okay, now we have one more test, a lie detector. We have to put you on a lie detector. I said, what?
Were you very concerned about that, Marty?
I was very concerned. I thought about all the things I had done wrong in my life, stealing candy bars, you know, all that stuff. I said, why do I have to be in a lie detector? He said, look, just listen to me. So I went on a lie detector, and this was 1965, and of course they wanted to know anything that could lead to being blackmailed. They wanted to know my financial situation, that I owe any money. They wanted to know my sexual proclivity, because in those days, if you were gay, you could be blackmailed. They wanted to know everything about my life, and they asked me very intimate questions. Obviously, I passed the test, because I wouldn't be here now, and I said, I'm still not sure I want to go. And he said, how much money are you making right now? And I said, $8,000 a year. He said, we'll double it. I said, oh my God, I'm rich. So I came to Connecticut, the first time I had ever been there, and started working for this company called Perkin Elmer.
Well, I don't think we'll have time to get into your answers on your sexual proclivity, but perhaps that might keep some of the audience tuned in. But it was enough to make you come to Perkin Elmer.
Right, and when they explained to me what it was, what they wanted to do, I was in a room with about 30 other guys that they had just hired, and some old-timers who were working on this thing, and they said, we want to build the most sophisticated camera ever to go in space, to stay up there a year. It's going to have 60 miles of film. Remember, there was no digital photography in those days. And it's going to send the film back to Earth periodically and be caught by an airplane with a parachute.
Let me get this straight. This was a satellite that was up in space, way up, I assume, but you'll give me some details.
Yeah.
And it was taking film pictures, which stayed in the satellite, and then somehow or other it had to get down here to be developed and analyzed.
Yeah, but let me back up a second. You got to understand the times. I don't know if you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 when Russia had put armed missiles in Cuba that we didn't even know were there until airplanes found them, airplane photography. And this scared the heck out of the US because we didn't know what the Russians were capable of. We didn't know if the Cubans were in control of nuclear-tipped missiles. And we were in a panic. We didn't know what was going on. We had used to have airplanes that flew over Russia, the U-2, but when they were able to shoot that down, we lost all, we became blind. And this led to a little paranoia in the country. There were actually people in this country at that time who wanted to do a preemptive strike on Russia, which would have been World War III. So anyhow, when I understood the importance of this project, I was on board. This thing, as I mentioned, weighed 60,000 pounds. It contained 60 miles of film. It had to fly over the Soviet Union and China and other countries, and it had to be at an altitude of 90 miles in space, 80 to 90, so it would last for a year without burning up. Now, there's a lot of problems in what I just said. When you're at that altitude, you're going around the Earth every 18 hours. You're going essentially about 18,000 miles an hour. The Earth goes 1,000 miles an hour. So in order to take imagery, the film has to go very fast because the Earth is moving very fast under you, like 200 inches per second. This film was 6 inches wide. We had 60 miles of it. And we had these optics which would do stereo looking at the Earth as we flew around taking pictures.
Now, the idea of this was to give us a better understanding of what the Soviets were doing so that we wouldn't overreact or even underreact.
Right. We had to know where their missiles were, if they had them, where their troops were, where their submarines were. You could tell by looking at imagery exactly what they were planning militarily, and not just Russia.
Before we get into what sounds totally impossible to me, the technology in doing film at 200 inches a minute, a second.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. It shows how impossible it seems to me.
It was almost.
And 60 miles and all that. Who were the people that came up with this idea? What part of the armed services were responsible?
Well, originally there's a thing called the National Reconnaissance Organization, the NRO. That's the top of the organization. Under them are the CIA and the other places, the NSA, the people that collect electrical information, like right now emails and phone messages, the things that are in the newspapers. But the CIA was responsible for two things, HUMINT and OPTINT. HUMINT is human intelligence. That's where you see all these spies going into other countries wearing trench coats and getting killed, trying to get their information. That's what I thought the CIA was only. OPINT is optical intelligence. This is where you want to fly over your potential enemy without them knowing it and gather data about what they're planning. Now, as you mentioned before, the real problem was you had to get this film back periodically. So we had, as I mentioned, 60 miles of film on a big supply, and there were 4 take-up reels, so each held 15 miles of film. So every 3 months, you'd fill up one of the reels, and then it would automatically cut and splice it to the next reel, and then the reel that was filled up with film would be shot down to Earth from 90 miles out in space with a parachute. He was falling at many thousands of miles an hour. 2 planes would fly with a cable between them and catch it on a hook and reel it in. Okay, and that was just the beginning.
That sounds like a Cirque du Soleil kind of activity.
It was a Cirque du Soleil.
Now, were they successful from the beginning on that pickup?
They missed the first one. It went into the ocean. And we were very afraid that the Russians would find it and know exactly what our capabilities were. So Howard Hughes and Bob, I forget his name, the guy who founded Titanic, Bob Ballin, I think it was, designed and built a special vehicle that went down thousands of feet under the ocean, and we were able to lift it out of the water. It took about 7 months to do, and of course the film was all ruined, but we had it. It was all crushed. It was so deep that the whole thing had crushed to pieces, even though it was, thousands of pounds.
I can only imagine the amount of money that was spent on this project, and they paid you a measly $16,000 a year.
But remember, we still had 3 more spools. That was the only failure. There were 20 missions, 20 launches. It started in 1971, and the last one was in 1986. The 1986 launch blew up at the launch pad, and we don't know if it was an accident or sabotage or what. There were certain events going on in Russia then, which I'm sure they didn't want us to know about. So it could have been, who knows? I'm not privy to that. But it was a very successful program. And of course, when that program ended, the next thing was moving into was digital photography, which was a whole different thing.
Now, I'm just so curious about how this Mission Impossible became possible. What were one or two of the most difficult technological problems?
First of all, the film was a very special film. This film had the highest resolution of any film ever made. It's still a top secret number. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
I don't want to know.
And it had to be ultra thin to keep the weight down. And it was so sensitive that only blind people could process it. When that reel came down, within one day, there was a special facility in Kodak in Rochester, a building with no windows and no lights. Only blind people worked there. All the machines were controlled by Braille. They took this thousands of pounds of film and within 2 days cut it up into thousands and thousands of stereo color pictures and shipped it down to Washington to a special facility where there were hundreds of people looking at it with stereo microscopes and building three-dimensional models of what they saw. So it took, like, from the time it left the spacecraft at 90 miles up to the time it was on the desk of the president or whoever was making the decisions, it was 3 days. Unbelievable, right? Of course, now you could do it right now in real time because you just point and it comes down, you know, digitally.
So I assume in those good old days, you did not have computers to help you out.
No, there was one master computer, but that was not very practical. Everything was done with slide rules. I don't know if people know what that is.
Ah, funny you should mention. I don't know how many people these days know what a slide rule is, but I have a picture. I have a slide rule here, and I showed this to my grandchild today and try to remember how to do it. But I'm going to give this to you. This is actually, this slide rule is a chemical slide rule. It only has about half the scales that the slide rules you had probably had. But why don't you just, if you can, on this, I have a B and an A scale somewhere.
If I can remember.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well,
but I can do it.
Okay.
I have to also say, every engineer in those days had an orange leather pouch like that on his belt with his slide rule and his little, we were really nerdy, you know, with a little thing with all the pocket protector.
Right, you were the guys that couldn't get dates. I remember because I was an engineer too.
Busy. But anyhow, what you did with this was you could multiply, divide any number like a calculator, but it's not digital. So what you do is you put the inside one over one number, and it could be 1,633,000, and then you move this over to the other number, and then you read down the answer. It's very complicated, not that accurate, because, you know, it's only as accurate as the spacing of the lines. I mean, compared to something digital, this is maybe 1%, 100 times less accurate. Yet we had to use this and things like this to calculate such a complicated system, which I didn't even get into yet. I mean, why it's so complicated. And we also had no digital drawings. Everything was hand-drawn.
So why don't you give me an idea of some of the complications that you overcame?
All right. The most important one was this. Film was God. You couldn't waste film. Now you got to remember, this is a 60,000-pound aircraft. We have these heavy spools of film. If you ever stopped it while it's in orbit, it would knock it out of orbit. The momentum change. You couldn't reverse the film, you couldn't stop it. It had to keep going at 200 inches per second. Even though you're only looking at the Earth when you're pointing down and the optics rotated like a cylinder.
Yes.
So for 2/3 of the time, you'd be wasting the film. Only 1/3 of the film would be used. So one of the main challenges we had was, what do you do with the film when you're not taking pictures? So we had to create like another camera on top of that camera, which took the film and changed its path and diverted it over a long distance until the optics were ready to take a picture again, and then it went back into that camera and shot the imagery. Bigger problem. If you work at the geometry at that altitude of a spinning optical system with a moving Earth, the image is rotating 270 degrees. So you can imagine you got this film going at 200 inches per second, and you have to rotate it 270 degrees. Well, if you think about it, it would wind up like a pretzel.
Yes.
So we had to create these air bars, which are these bars with holes in it, with air in it shooting in, where the film actually floated. And no one thought this could ever work. And remember, we had no computers to model it. It was all ideas. Yes, we built a lot of hardware to test things, but that was not in space. We had never put anything in space before that was complicated. We didn't even know how it worked. I'll give you a simple example. We had all these moving parts. You have to lubricate them or they break. Well, we learned that when you go in space, all the lubricant disappears because there's no gravity. It just evaporates. And within a few days, everything would come to a screeching halt. So we had to get chemistry people in there who knew chemistry to design a brand new type of lubricant, which is still in use today, that would work for a year in space.
And how did you know, or how did the satellite know, what part of Earth it was looking at?
Oh, that's a more interesting problem. There was a secret group in the CIA who had target decks. These are updated daily from spies in the field of where you wanted to look. Now, the big problem was if there were clouds, you couldn't see. This is visible. So then you had weather decks. We had the whole reason there are weather satellites now to give you the weather is because of this program. Wow. You had to know what the weather was everywhere. You had to have satellites all around the world. So you take the target decks and the weather decks and you upload through commands system. Remember, there's no computer on board. All you're doing is setting a bunch of switches to tell it when to look where. Now the Russians, after a couple of years, knew we had this, so they would wait for cloudy days to do certain things they didn't want us to see. So, but we had the ability to come back 90 minutes later and look again. We could look anywhere, but we were continually moving at, as I said, 18,000 miles an hour in space.
And did you use the stars for guidance in some way?
Well, that's the other problem. Now I've got tens of thousands of frames of film of Russia and China and who knows where else. How do you know where you are? You say, okay, look, there's missiles. Where is it? The only way to know where you were is we had another camera looking at all the stars. Remember, the stars are always out up there.
Sure.
And we projected the stars onto the picture as it was exposed. So when the guy looked at the picture, he also saw in a different color all the stars that were there, the constellations. And there were computers in the CIA, big giant ones, IBM type business things, that would figure out the latitude and longitude on Earth to 2 feet based on those stars. Sort of like GPS. We didn't have GPS in those days. But so again, all this was amazing. There were 600 moving parts. There was up to 1,000 engineers working on this in a company that had only had 100 people working before. And that led to the security issue. This was so classified that it affected us personally. No one could be told what you did up there. If anybody asked you, you'd say, where?
So let's talk about life at Perkin Elmer for you and these other engineers, and home life in relation to that.
Well,
so what about the working environment?
Well, the working environment was very scary because the CIA had agents planted in the company to make sure. In fact, when you go out to lunch in Danbury, go to a restaurant, or just talk with your friends, or sit in the car and talk, some of those people were CIA agents acting as engineers. They were engineers, but you didn't know who was CIA. If you were found to talk about that program, not accidentally, but if you said, by the way, I'm working on, you disappeared.
Disappeared.
You disappeared.
Like in Argentina,
I have
disappeared?
no idea what happened to these people. You never saw them again. Now, that was intentional. But we also had, we would work till 2, 3 in the morning. We had these big safes. Everything had to be locked up before you left. And they had a special room with scrambled phones and all that. Well, one night I was working till 2 in the morning. I was tired. I left this top secret document on my desk. Now, even though the whole building is classified and there were armed guards everywhere, I violated the law. The next morning, I got called in and they said, Marty, you left your document. I said, sorry. I said, you get 2 chances, maybe 3. After that, you're not going to go to jail because you didn't do it intentionally, but you'll lose your clearance. Now, in those days, that meant you'll never work in the United States as an engineer because you needed clearance almost to work. Everybody was building military stuff. This is before NASA was the whole thing, which was even now, NASA, you need clearance because there's a lot of mutual technology being developed. So it was very scary. So as a 26-year-old and 27, I worked on it for 20 years. It was very, very intense. But the worst thing was my home life. I have to say right up front, my wife left me because of this job. I had 2 little children, 4 and 2. I was married about 5 years, 6 years. If she called me at night to try to reach me, they'd say he's not here. If I went on a trip for 2 weeks, and sometimes I didn't know I was going on that trip till I showed up at work that day, and they said, here's your bag all packed, you're going to X. I said, can I tell my wife? They said, no way. If there was an emergency at home, she couldn't reach me. She thought I was fooling around and I was not working. I was going somewhere else, you know, and I couldn't tell her. In fact, this program was not declassified until 2011.
That's why we have the pleasure of your company here.
And I have to say what happened in 2011. Even though the program ended in 1986, the technology was so advanced, and it did prevent World War III. When we saw those pictures, we saw that the Russians were bluffing. Many of their submarines were made out of rubber. They were balloons to make it look like they had this whole fleet of submarines ready to attack. There were threats. They did have 20,000 nuclear weapons aimed at us, and we were able to see every one of them, and we were able to see they were not armed. It led to the SALT talks. I don't know if people remember that, the arms limitation talks, which led to Nixon and Reagan eventually to have disarmament with the Russians. We were not, so you know, it got rid of the paranoia. When you know what your enemy is doing, it's the best thing. And we wanted them to know what we were doing, because you don't want somebody making a mistake, assuming the worst case that isn't true.
That's right. Now, beside the...
But I wanted to say also about the consequence. I had to travel a lot, and this is so stupid. I had to carry top secret documents. There was no email. You couldn't use the U.S. mail even. So they handcuffed the briefcase to my arm. I'm going on an airplane. And I would say, isn't this kind of obvious? Now, in the 70s, there were a lot of hijackings to Cuba. I don't know if you remember, a lot of planes were hijacked, taken to Cuba. And they told me that if the plane ever gets hijacked, you have to go into the bathroom on the airplane and eat the documents if you can't flush them down. I said, what? He said, yeah, they were made out of very thin onion paper, except they were greenish. I guess they were like avocados. But, I mean, it was so crazy times. And I would have done it. I would have done it.
Did you ever taste it?
I tasted it. It tastes like avocado.
It did.
I could have used some dip with it, though.
It wasn't guacamole. It was just the avocado.
Yeah, it was just the, I should say that when the program was declassified, my 2 children, and I had another child after that with another second marriage, were invited to Washington for a ceremony honoring the people that did this. And Leon Panetta was there, and President Obama said hello and goodbye. But Leon Panetta basically did it, and a whole bunch of generals and CIA people. And when my kids heard about it, and they had a model of it there for one day, it took place at the Smithsonian Museum near Dulles Airport. And it was a wonderful ceremony. Unfortunately, many of the really brilliant people that worked on it were dead, because the program ended in 1986, and this was 2011. Many of those people were 40 and 50 when I joined at age 25. So whoever was left got on a bus, 22 people out of maybe a few hundred that really did the grunt work. Not the guys who built it or anything, but the design. And we got a little medal and a badge. But my kids were blown away, because for 2 reasons. 1, they didn't know what I did. And 2, they saw why I wasn't home. You know, they grew up thinking, what a terrible father. You know, for those years, I wasn't there during the years when they were like from 2 to 15.
Is this the cost of being a patriot? Home life?
I'm sure because I was young, I overdid it. I'm sure older people figured out a way to say, because not everybody's family ended, but I was so, I mean, they scared me. The people I had to work with there, were nuts, some of them. I have to say that. I mean, I'll get in trouble for saying it, but they're all gone now. But they really were afraid that we were going to be destroyed, and we should do it first, and then everybody's destroyed. My kids would be gone.
Yeah.
You know, there's no way once you start a mass nuclear war to stop it.
Well, that's probably why they had such an amazing technology put together. So they must have had quite a few really superior, beside yourself, some superior people, Nobel Prize winners, notable personalities.
Well, the president had a thing called the PSAC committee. George Bush was the head of the CIA there, who later became president, the first President Bush.
Right.
He would come every few months with this committee to review us design. Remember, we couldn't model it, And this PSAC committee, which stood for Presidential Scientific Advisory Committee, consisted of David Packard of Hewlett-Packard, Edwin Land, who invented the Polaroid camera,
right?
2 Nobel Prize winners. One was who worked on the atom bomb. One was my hero, and I can't think of his name right now.
Oppenheimer, Teller?
No.
Einstein?
No. It'll come to you. Anyhow, and some generals. And we would get up in front of them, and I was shaking like a leaf, trying to explain this complicated thing that we didn't even understand, but we had to keep moving. The schedule, it had to be launched by 1971. And, but they were the nicest people. They would thank me and then pull me aside out of the audience later and explain to me what they thought I should do differently to make life easier. They were just wonderful people. People that are really smart, are always willing to help other people that are not so smart. Mm-hmm. People that say, I'm busy, don't bother me, I think are insecure.
Well, I assume you're one of the smarter ones.
Well, I was smart then. I should have gone into banking, I would have made a lot more money.
I would really like to continue this conversation. We're about to run out of time here,
okay.
So if we can, we'll just continue on another show,
okay.
And get into more of this. And some of what you've done after, well, you were with Perkin Elmer when you did this.
Yeah, from 65 till I retired in 98. And that led to the Hubble Space Telescope.
I was going to say, you worked on other things after this.
Yeah, well, because we had this fantastic facility to simulate space and large spacecraft, it was perfect for the Hubble. It saved the government hundreds of millions of dollars by, they had to compete the contract, but it was obvious we'd win. And Hubble was fantastic because I could talk about it. This is still up there, This was launched over 20 years ago, and it's discovered billions of galaxies we never knew existed. It's beginning now to find planets like Earth, which probably have not humans, but intelligent life on it. It discovered black holes. It found dark energy.
Yeah, that's intelligent life as opposed to humans.
Opposed to humans.
No, I would like to go forward with that, but we're going to have to close off now.
Well, thank you.
I promised an interesting program with an interesting person on an interesting subject, and I'm sure in my heart and mind we've delivered it, because you are truly amazing, a patriot, a genius, a scientist. I can tell that you're humble, and I'm just really pleased that we've had this opportunity, and I want to say goodbye and thank you, and we're going to be talking again very soon.
Richard Feynman.
Richard Feynman was the atomic
scientist, right. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Marty. A pleasure. Goodbye, everyone. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you. That was good.
You were excellent.